proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
At this time 1 year ago, the Democratic Party was in the middle of a hysterical meltdown over a new voting law in the state of Georgia. The President of the United States declared the state's modest changes to election procedures were, quote, Jim Crow 2.0. He said the law was about voter suppression and election subversion. He said citizens should doubt, quote, whether your vote counts at all. The sitting president of the United States said lawmakers' positions on this bill would define, listen to this, whether we were on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace, John Lewis or Bull Connor, Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis. The Senate Democratic leader said that his fellow United States senators who are Republicans were, and I quote, supporting the reenactment of those Jim Crow laws. My colleague from New York, as the Senate Majority Leader, is supposed to safeguard and steward this institution. Instead, he tried to destroy the Senate and nuke the 60-vote threshold so that Democrats could take over all 50 states' election laws on a partisan basis. And believe it or not, 47 of the other 49 Democrats went right along with him. The liberal hysteria spread to the press and the private sector. Woke activists started talking about boycotting companies like Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines. Major League Baseball caved and moved the All-Star game out of Atlanta, directly harming the local economy, all for the sake of symbolism. Now, Republicans said this was unhinged, phony outrage over a common sense law that would make it both easy to vote and, of course, hard to cheat. Democrats said the new voting rules were evil and racist and the literal death of democracy. Well, Mr. President, the facts are now in. We have hard evidence. After the new bill took effect in early 2022, the state of Georgia held a primary election. You know what happened? Record turnout for a primary. Then last November, Georgia had a general election. What happened? A new record for ballots cast in a midterm. Oh, some might say, but that doesn't tell us anything about the voting conditions. Maybe there were terribly long lines. Maybe there were sinister roadblocks, and voters persevered in spite of them. But alas, except an academic research center at the University of Georgia spent weeks conducting a major survey of Georgia voters after the election. So let's take a look at what they found. 72% of all Georgia voters and 73% of black voters specifically said their voting experience was, quote, excellent, end quote. 92% of all voters and 92% of black voters specifically said that either that voting had gotten easier since the prior election or that there was no difference. 92% of all voters in Georgia said voting had either gotten easier or there was no difference between that election and prior elections. More than 70% of black voters in Georgia said they waited less than 10 minutes to cast their ballot. This is all the supposed Jim Crow law in action? Record high turnout? Lightning fast voting lines? A supermajority of African American voters rating their experience under the new voting rules as excellent? But here's the icing on the cake. The same Democratic Party that cheered Major League Baseball for moving the All-Star game out of Atlanta listen to this, now has Atlanta as on the short list for the next Democratic National Convention. Well, here's what happened. We were right, and they were wrong. But it goes beyond that. These people actually lied. They invoked our darkest history and slandered half the country because they wanted more power for themselves. Some of the most powerful people in our entire country, including the President of the United States, staked their personal credibility to these claims. President Biden screamed from a podium that the bad old days of Jim Crow were back. Over this? The majority leader from New York tried to destroy the Senate. Over this? The American people were subjected to months of baseless, pointless media haranguing. Over this? And the country is supposed to go on pretending like nothing happened? We're all supposed to take the president and the vice president and Senate Democrats seriously the next time they start shouting and waving their arms about the next supposed crisis? I don't think so. I don't think the American people will forget who kept their credibility and who lit theirs on fire. Now, on an entirely different matter, today, Ranking Member Capito of the Environment and Public Works Committee will introduce an important resolution on behalf of millions of American farmers, ranchers, and builders. 2 years ago, the Biden administration picked up an Obama-era crusade to micromanage the small businesses that help feed, clothe, and power America. Literally, on President Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order that began tearing down the regulatory certainty that Republicans had worked hard to restore for American workers and entrepreneurs. And in December, this crusade yielded a new rule from EPA that enacted a dizzying new definition of which temporary, tributary, and upland waterways fall under the federal government's authority. Mr. President, there's a case before the Supreme Court on this very subject right now. The court's ruling in Sackett versus EPA will provide new clarity on just how far federal bureaucrats can stretch their powers to meddle in working Americans' business under the Clean Water Act. But instead of waiting to see whether a massive expansion of the regulatory state would be legal, the Biden EPA went ahead with their new rule. Can you imagine why Washington Democrats would be in such a rush to get ahead of the law? So what does this latest power grab by Washington Democrats mean for working people out in our country? Well, for starters, it means that cattlemen, contractors, and all sorts of folks have now had to put up with three major changes to federal regulation on the lands where they do business in just the past 8 years. Democrats' relentless attempts to step on state and local authorities in their own backyards has left small business owners across America chasing moving goalposts. The Biden administration's latest rule means it'll be harder for farmers in Kentucky to figure out which ditches on their property are subject to the whims of Washington bureaucrats. It'll create new headaches for builders in West Virginia trying to make sure they dot every I and cross every T on much-needed development projects. It'll mean ranchers out west may discover that every ditch and low-lying puddle they own, even ones that only hold water when it rains, is now the business of EPA. And as every American who's tried to create jobs or build something knows, red tape doesn't just cost valuable time. Legal experts project the Biden administration's latest overreach would raise the cost of development and infrastructure projects near waterways by, listen to this, $1 million an acre. So while President Biden takes a victory lap on infrastructure projects made possible by bipartisan work, This latest salvo in Washington, Democrats' war on working Americans, would devastate the sort of small businesses that actually build those infrastructure projects. But it isn't going unanswered. 25 governors, representing fully half the states in our country, have condemned the EPA's Waters of the United States rule. And here in the Senate, West Virginia's own Senator Capito has consistently led our efforts to cut the overreaching regulatory state back down to size. She sponsored the legislation that would have codified the last administration's common sense fixes. She spearheaded Congress' brief to the Supreme Court as it considers this issue. And today, she will introduce her Congressional Review Act resolution to give every one of our colleagues the opportunity to protect the future of transformative infrastructure, energy, and agriculture projects in their states. West Virginians should be proud that one of their 2 senators is committed to reforms that get more Washington messes out of their way. I'm proud to support Senator Capito's resolution and would urge each of my colleagues to do the same.